MSU. It's fun to be here.
I know. Welcome back.
Thank you. So Art is a cellist. Art is a conductor. Do you find that depending on the hat you're wearing, that what that art is changes, or is there a similarity?
Both. I've actually had a few experiences now where I've, in a concert setting, been able to do both, not at the same time, but I've sat as a cellist and next movement get up and conduct, and then next movement go back and play cello, which is pretty interesting. Brain activity wise, I feel like it taps into different parts of my thinking process and awareness. It was definitely a challenge, but overall, I think they're very, very similar, and I'm pretty grateful that my conducting has made me a better cellist, and vice versa. But no, I think they're similar, but definitely use different areas of the brain, leading an ensemble versus, just sitting on one part. And yeah.
Sure. Well, okay. So as a cellist, you are, let's see, you're, I would say, responsible for, maybe someone might say you have the luxury of focusing on like what your individual part, basically.
Yes.
How am I going to do this shift?
Yes.
Here's this piano for this one note. How am I going to do that in my bow?
Mm-hmm.
As a conductor, I would imagine you have to have the ability to step back and look at the piece as a whole. You have to have an understanding of how it's going to unfold. And you need to be taking all of that into account. Mm-hmm. So if you're holding a baton versus a bow, mm-hmm. is that one of the things that changes the perspective of how much you're looking back, or an amount of detail, or is something else?
Yeah, I think as a conductor, I spend a lot more time beforehand looking at the finer details and making decisions on those things before I even get to the rehearsal, so that when I'm at rehearsal, I can pull back and kind of focus on those bigger things. Of course, you're doing some of that as an individual musician and instrumentalist as well, but I think more of that is happening before I get in front of an ensemble. Yeah.
Wow, that's great to use the word like that.
Sorry.
A lot of the music that requires a conductor, and this might have its limitations, but I'll word it that way anyway. A lot of the music that requires a conductor is exploring very complicated, contrasting emotions. Those are usually connected. I wonder if there is a different amount of responsibility, of expectation put on a conductor versus a performer to have a greater sense of the full depth of emotion that's being explored in a piece. Do you feel a greater sense of responsibility for that if you're about to use your bow versus your baton, or does that seem similar?
I think it has definitely changed in the last several years in my experience of being a conductor. I think initially I would have said, oh yeah, absolutely. Bigger responsibility is the conductor. And in a sense, I still feel that way a bit. I've been taught that, the first rehearsal, you know everything. There's no learning for the conductor in the rehearsal process, because you are there to, be the expert and guide the ensemble. Of course, there are changes and adjustments, and working with different musicians, you get different interpretations, and that all changes. But you show up ready to roll with your interpretation, at least. But I think that I've, over time, tried to apply that for myself as a cellist as well. The longer I'm a conductor, the more I put the expectation on myself as a cellist to show up with the same amount of awareness of the entire ensemble. Or, of course, I'm not going to necessarily worry about breathing details or anything like that in a wind part. Maybe some bowings in a violin part, but yeah, I'm pushing myself as a cellist the more I learn as a conductor to almost I don't want to say level up my musicianship as a cellist to meet the conductor level, but I think that if every instrumentalist or singer or whoever's not leading the ensemble got the opportunity to be a conductor, I think it would transform their experience as an instrumentalist or a singer, because it just kind of forces you to look at things differently, prepare differently, and almost makes the process easier because you show up.
Do you feel that
so
you're
detailed.
communicating differently or different things as a cellist or a conductor?
Yes and no. I think as a conductor, I'm definitely thinking about preparation a bit more and emotion. Communicating as a cellist is a bit more timing and whatnot, in which you'd think like, oh, a conductor would be the one doing timing, but I mean, that's the standing like question of, isn't a conductor just there to beat time? But I do find myself showing much more emotion as a conductor, and more timing and tempo as a cellist, I think.
So let's say you're sitting in a piano quintet as a cellist. What would you be concerned with communicating to your colleagues in that instance, and what would you be interested in communicating to the audience as a cellist in a piano quintet?
Well, I think that as a cellist in communicating with the quintet, I think a lot of that comes from the rehearsal and actually articulating with words, a bit more communication. I think that's the beauty of being in an intimate chamber group, is kind of that verbal discussion of like, what do we want to do here, and how much time do we want to take, and are we going to do it the same or different, and how does this relate to this last movement and whatnot. So I find that is more of what I see myself doing as a cellist in a setting like that. As far as communicating to the audience, yeah, I'd say it's probably more emotion and ideas of a melodic material, of the grander idea of a piece as a whole.
Okay, same question now. You're on the podium.
Yeah.
What do you want to communicate? Who are you communicating to, first of all, when you're on the podium? And what do you, at your core, want to be communicating?
It's funny. I think I'm moving a lot more as a conductor, I think, in bigger gestures, obviously, than as a cellist. But obviously my back is to the audience, which is a huge difference as a performer facing an audience. I don't necessarily think that I forget there's an audience behind me, but I think when I'm conducting, I see it as a responsibility for the ensemble in front of me, not the audience. It's their responsibility to communicate their ideas and their sound to the audience, and I'm there to guide them along and remind them and, gesture this and emote that. And I don't forget that they're there, but there's almost I'm here for you guys to be there for them.
Sure.
Yeah.
I did, in prepping for today, I did some deep diving, and I found a really wonderful spotlight that MSU, Minot State, did on you when you started working with the development department.
Yeah.
And I want to read a quote from that, from
okay.
you. quoted by you in this spotlight.
Let's see if I remember.
The arts have a special way of connecting people through emotion, life experiences, and a greater purpose, and in a very deep way. I'm so eager to find more ways to continue engaging our alum and friends in supporting these crucial opportunities within music and the arts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wonderful. I was wondering if we could unpack some of that.
Sure.
I was hoping we could start with connection through emotion. Can you elaborate on this as an idea?
Yeah. I think that most people would agree, and you grew up in this area. I think this goes for many other communities, but North Dakota, I feel like we're known in many ways to be an area of strong German, kind of stoic Scandinavian vibe, where there isn't a lot of emoting. It's not to say that it's not underneath the surface, because I think there is a lot underneath the surface for everyone. But this area is very good at kind of having that strong outer shell of hard work ethic. We get it done. And I grew up here. I moved away to the Pacific Northwest, and I've now moved back. And that is something that performing and working with different musicians as both a cellist and conductor and some singing, that I feel like has become much more apparent to me than when I was growing up. And I think that so many people decide to go to a concert and sit down and enjoy the music, and, that was great, clap, 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 go home. And I think that those opportunities are maybe sometimes not fully tapped into as far as talking with audiences about emotion and experiences and just making music relevant for people, and the connection between a musician and an audience. There's certainly an emotional connection there, but I think some of what we can be doing more of is encouraging people that when the performance is done, when they've left the concert hall and they go home, they have opportunities to sit with music, whether it has text or not, stories behind it or not, to think about how it affects them. What does it remind them of their childhood, or experience of like social injustice, things like that. I think there's opportunity, especially here, for us to kind of unpack that a bit more and have more conversations like outside of the performance space, and dig deeper on our connections with people.
That ties to one of the second things you listed that I had really fun kind of pondering, life experiences. You might mean it in a third or even fourth way, but the two ways I was maybe parsing that in my mind was, I'm wondering if life experiences, is this the idea that a composer or creator can write life experiences into art or into music, and thereby when someone gets to experience that piece of art, they get to truly experience someone else's life, which creates compassion and other things? Or I was wondering if in this particular quote, or however you might think now, if it's changed, if life experiences is more in the idea of, I think it's specifically say shared life experiences, that, wow, if you get 300-400 people in one room and they get to all experience the same piece of music at the same time, that is a physiological bond of a shared thing, that maybe it shapes something in the long term. And maybe that's one of the reasons why something like classical music, as dirty of a term as that is, has stuck around so much. Or am I on the mark with one of these, or were you thinking something else?
I think both, absolutely. I think probably more of the latter. Shared experience is a great way of saying it, I think. But there really is something magical. Like, you can feel it. I've been to performances both on stage and in the audience where there's 5 to 10 people in a tiny little space, and you just can feel the sort of synergy between everyone. And I've been to performances where there's hundreds and hundreds of people in a hall, and you can still feel the same thing. So I don't think, size of audience in that sense really matters a whole lot. But yeah, I do think that, composers, yes, they had their experiences which informed their composing, and the emotion or story that goes within their composition. But I do think the most beautiful thing is having a set of 5 to 3,000 people sitting there and at the same time in the same space getting to experience a sound with these particular musicians. And, halfway across the world, there are a bunch of other people in a concert hall with those particular musicians, maybe hearing the same exact piece, but having a totally different experience based on their community or the musicians or what's going on in their country's political situation. So yeah, I think music shifts with whoever is listening at the time and whatever they're experiencing at the time. I don't know if you've ever experienced like hearing a piece as a young musician and remembering how you experienced that or experienced performing it or whatever. And then now as an adult revisiting something and having a different experience or a different perspective, or and not just because you grew or developed as a musician, but you're in some ways the same but different person now than you were at that young age. And I think that's it's a beautiful experience. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really remarkable. The last one I want to just unpack a little is you talk about, I'll reread it so we have the context, that the arts have a special way of connecting people through emotion, life experiences, and a greater purpose. What's the greater purpose?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll touch on an experience that I had this past year. I got to perform, I think it was 2 or 3 different performances of considering Matthew Shepard. And for those who don't know, Matthew Shepard was a gay young man who was beaten and left in a field to die. It's assumed that it was kind of a hate crime, and Craig Heller Johnson composed this work. It's just a beautiful work, story aside. Beautiful music, very diverse in the kind of genre of music that's interspersed throughout it. But of course, the story is intense and heartbreaking, and also really beautiful in many ways. And getting to perform that anywhere, but in an area that I would say is not quite as eager to view kind of an inclusive, welcoming vibe in that sense. it was interesting and a little bit challenging. Every performance I went into wondering who was going to be in the audience, if we had supporters of LGBTQ, people who were not supporters. I think looking back, we probably had a mix of people. And of course, I felt a ton of honor and a huge amount of responsibility as a musician to perform this music for an audience, regardless of their views of LGBTQ identity and all of that. But it was one of the more intense experiences I think I've had, where I really recognized that, wow, I'm responsible for joining these fellow musicians and putting on a performance where I don't want to say an audience is forced to, but encouraged to really look at this story, look at the story of this young man's life, what happened, how his life ended, how in many ways he was just like you and me and your own son or grandson or whatever. And that was a musical experience for me that I'm so grateful for, and I hope I get to do tons more, as intense as they are, because I think it does encourage people to really reflect and talk and try to understand and open their hearts. And it's just and it's kind of wild to think that it's music, that I mean there was text and poetry and letters that were included in the performance and whatnot, but it's music that is like such a powerful catalyst to have those reflections and conversations with people. And I think music has always been that. There have been opportunities for that for hundreds and hundreds of years. But I think we need to keep doing it. And music isn't just there for the enjoyment, clapping, going home. It's there to encourage growth and connection, like I said. And yeah, I feel the further I get along in my musical career, the more I see my work as important work that is doing a lot more than entertaining.
Sure. Along those lines, I had a lot of fun. Boy, that's a horrible segue to go from that beautiful to say I had a lot of fun. Well, okay. I had a lot of fun working through my way through all of your conducting videos on your YouTube channel.
Every conductor hates having their conducting videos viewed.
I found them and I kept watching it. I just thoroughly enjoyed it. All of your motions were so natural, gestural, and very poetic in a lot of places. And one thing that stood out was the remarkable consistency with which you always had such a heightened level of poise. And specifically that word was what came to mind. And then as I was listening through, I found myself thinking and wondering, it's interesting that a lot of the music that I'm watching being Abbie conduct is exploring emotions that are at the very least the opposite of poise, inelegance, tension, anticipation, these kind of things. So I started wondering, well, as someone who routinely delves into the psyche and the music of Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, and Mozart, I'm curious about your thoughts about the intersection of gender and artistic expression. I'm wondering if there is a sense of additional pressure for women in powerful positions, in this case, you being on the podium, to hold a certain level of composure, even if in this case the music requires almost an abandonment of it.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I would be lying if I had never stopped to think about how my gestures would be viewed with me being a female. And I think kind of what you were getting at is, if a conductor identifying as a male stands up on the podium and shows an angry gesture and trying to get that sound out of the orchestra, if I, as a female, were to do that exact same gesture, would it be perceived differently or too over the top or, all that stuff? I have thought about it. I don't think, though, that I have really altered my gestures to fit that sort of thing. I don't think I change my gestures to seem less crazy as a female or whatever you want to call it. But I do kind of sideways of that is I do feel that as a conductor, there is a line of going overboard as far as being distracting. I think conductors, their interpretation, not necessarily of the music itself, but their gestures change over time. You learn what works with different ensembles and what doesn't work. The way I would conduct a very, very young, kind of fresh orchestra would not be the same way I would probably want to conduct a seasoned professional orchestra. Something that young musicians need to really get sound out. I think professionals would be very turned off by. Some might not. I mean, some appreciate it and love to have that encouragement. But I think it does depend on the ensemble that you're conducting. And yeah, I definitely am getting more into my kind of natural comfort zone as a conductor. I'm sure some of the videos you've watched, and I say, okay, everyone should know that I've really only been conducting for 8 years maybe, which is not really a long time. I've been studying cello, playing cello since I was 5 years old, almost 30 years. 30 years is very different than 7, 8, 9 years as a conductor. So I'm still pretty young as a conductor. I still have a lot more that I want to develop. I think I would say just in the last, 3 years, I've finally felt like I'm more comfortable on the podium. I mean, the first few years, you're just like a baby giraffe learning how to walk and do all this stuff, time management, being in charge, but yet being collaborative and respectful of the musicians who have, played Beethoven 30 times and you've conducted it 1 time. It's a big difference. So I'm kind of getting off track of your question, but what I'm trying to say is I have thought about the sort of gender interpretation of gesture and whatnot. But I just kind of go for it, and it's developing as I get more experience and changes with the ensemble that I work with, changes with how much coffee I've had. And yeah.
Well, it doesn't look like 8 or 9 years. It looks like you should be just belong on a podium. Let's go 100%
thank you.
natural. I might, to wrap things up, circle back to something you said really early on that it's really intriguing to me.
Sure.
I don't want to put the wrong words in your mouth and what you said, but something to the effect of you don't want to show up to rehearsal having to learn things. You show up to rehearsal as a conductor knowing.
Yes.
Um,
And I will say, to add to that, I would expect musicians to show up as well, like in the ensemble, ready to roll too. But I think there's an added element as a conductor.
Yeah. Certainly as a player or as someone who has to conceive of or think of music on that large scale, the more things don't have to be thought of in the more moment figured out, the more mental space is available to take things in.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is, you've been a musician, a wonderful musician for 30 plus years, regardless of cellist or conductor. I had the privilege of getting to hear you play as a young cellist. And I'm wondering, having taken the knowledge of being a cellist and all the minutiae that has to be done to make something to come to life through the instruments, and then as a conductor sitting and looking at a score from bar 1 into the last bar and pulling all these things together, you know how you need to do the upbeats to help the conductor or help the orchestra move together, help to get the emotions across. You put in the thought of, I need to do this gesture or this gesture to help communicate this thing, even if it's not directly to the audience, so that the orchestra can communicate to the audience, all of this. In those moments, when all of the clockwork is in place, what do you take away in terms of learning about music on a deeper level from coming in, and your starting point is all of that stuff has been done, and now you get to stand in front of an orchestra and hear this music that's been performed probably hundreds of times, and you get to be in that moment hearing it in real time, not preoccupied by the details of because you already have figured that out. What do you take away from getting to be in that level of depth of really in the zone with that music?
Yeah, it's probably good that conductors are pulled out of that zone, because I think the more time they spend alone digging into those details, like, they can get into some trouble. Not to say that that's not important to spend that time doing that, but there have been tons of times where I've written in my score, like, I want to do this here and do this here and do this here, and think that it's going to be all these great details. And then you get into the first rehearsal and you're kind of humbled and slapped in the face, and you step back and think, like, okay, well, that would be nice, but there's no way that's going to work here because of X, Y, and Z, or, even just space of a performance space that you're performing in, how that changes your interpretation of details and whatnot. But I think for me, I would much rather go in having a baseline, at least, of this is my interpretation, but also being willing to adjust. And when I first look at a score for the very first time, as a young conductor, I'd have my pencils and my eraser and my ruler and all that stuff. And one of my conducting teachers was like, Abbie, put the pencils down, put it all aside and just open it up. Don't even listen to a recording or anything. Just page through it and just, what do you see? Just jumping out at the page. And so kind of just starting from that sort of simplified, like, let's just take a look. Let's just be curious. Then jumping in, doing all the details. And then it is almost like when you get to the first rehearsal or first few rehearsals, kind of pulling, again, like you said, back out of those details, and seeing, okay, how is this going to work with these musicians? It's one thing to have these ideas in my comfy chair with my cup of coffee with my cats and, I don't know, Asapaka, his interpretation that I have on my Spotify or whatever, but it's a good kind of pull back to where you start, or where at least I should start from, in not being so bogged down in the details. But I would hate to go into a rehearsal not having at least some interpretation of what I see it to be, or what I would like it to be. But yeah, I think most people would say that conductors are evolving and changing from this is the way it's going to be, and this is what I think. Let's try it. If it doesn't work, let's try something else. And yeah, the pullback is good, I think.
Well, thank you so much for being willing to sit with me
Thank
and
you.
share your wonderful thoughts on art and music. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Appreciate it.
I'll in the next couple of weeks, the goal is to not edit anything.
Okay.
I'll go through. I have 4 shots. I'll edit between the shots, and
Okay.
I'll send you a version.
Okay.
Let you watch it.